Good morning and welcome to this NZIOB webinar on the topic of collaborative working arrangements. My name is Malcolm Fleming, the Chief Executive of the NZIOB. Today's Auckland's construction sites start back up with the drop in COVID-19 alert levels. So we've likely lost a few attendees today, but it's certainly great news that the construction sites in Auckland are now back up and operating. The suggestion for today's webinar came from NZIOB board member Martin Fahey, who joins us as one of the three panellists. Collaborative working arrangements is something that Martin has a great deal of interest in and quite passionate about, and has great local experience running commercial projects both here in New Zealand and internationally. Some of his New Zealand experience includes running projects for some of New Zealand's largest construction companies, Mainzeal and Fletcher's. He is currently the new business and project director at Landsky Construction. Joining Martin will be Mike Quirk, who is our consultant representative. Mike is director at Becker Buildings and has been with Becker for over 25 years. And during that time, Mike has held a number of governance roles with the Becker business. Our client representative is Rob Stevens, who trained as an architect and transitioned to client representation about 20 years ago. Rob represented the Crown on some key anchor projects after the Christchurch rebuild and is currently the Department of Internal Affairs and holds the portfolio director role. The NZIOB's membership base spans the full construction supply chain with the promotion of collaborative approaches to delivering construction projects, one that we feel quite strongly about. Therefore, today's webinar has really good alignment with key values and principles of the NZIOB. So today we have a consultant, a contractor, and a client representative, which mirrors our own NZIOB membership base. I will now hand over to the three panelists and then we'll rejoin the webinar at the conclusion of the presentations, and I'll take questions at that time. So pose those questions through the platform tools and we'll run through those at the end of the presentations. Over to Martin, Rob, and Mike.
Good morning, everybody. It's Mike Quirk speaking. Thanks for that introduction. So the three of us are going to represent the primary functions of an overall project, and we're going to run through how a CWA works. And in that, it's Martin will start off with what is a CWA. Then we'll get a review of why a CWA from both Rob and Martin. And then I'll progress into talking about the process for a CWA. So in terms of what's common across the construction industry, we decided to provide a first set of slides that indicate the kind of width of project that has been undertaken using this kind of arrangement. So there's three there: correctional facility, America's Cup base, and for many of you will be very familiar with what was the temporary stadium in Christchurch. So Martin, I'll ask you to kick off with what's a CWA?
Thanks, Mike. Morning, everybody. Yeah, great news that we're back building stuff today in Auckland. None of us Aucklanders, of course, got a complex about being locked up while everyone else was doing other things, but there you go. So a collaborative working arrangement. I think if you look at the little illustration off to one side of the slide, the foundation of these things are those four key concepts: best for project, honesty, teamwork, and communication. So in its simplest form, a collaborative working process is a process through which two or more contracting parties collaborate together and jointly explore, and I think the key term there is innovative ways of doing business better, and again, to all parties' mutual advantage. So we've all been involved in projects where one party does really well, whether it's members of the supply chain or the client or the main contractor, but in a CWA, everybody gets the same benefit. And it's not business as usual, and it it needs a lot more than a cooperative spirit. It needs actually some significant behavioural change. And when fully, so those behavioural changes are shown there on the slide from the type of behaviours that we normally have to what you need to do to operate in a collaborative working arrangement. The key thing, I think, is the design, construct and completion frameworks. So it's just not getting to PC and flicking the owner is building and moving on. The whole completion framework's really important. The client is a fully active participant in the process, and people are seconded out of the client's team into the project delivery team. Participants are selected on capability, and that's an interesting word. You know, we use stress, capacity and ability, and I suppose in the current climate, capacity is a key factor, but you know, ability is not far behind it. There's a complete focus on understanding the design, and it's not just the building design, but understanding the operational needs of the client and how they're best suited to as you develop the design. And of course, active value engineering. And we all know that a lot of the best value engineering comes out of the supply chain, the various members of the supply chain that you bring into the CWA. They will provide smart ideas and clever ways of doing things. And the beauty of the CWA is that it captures all of that. Leveraging buying power. Again, whoever's in the CWA and has the best capability to buy particular things, then you allow them to buy them and you make use of that. And obviously with government projects, you have things like the government stores and other places where you can go and source equipment. I think another thing is active governance. And I can tell you, I've been involved in a few projects over the last few years where some of the issues were driven out of poor governance. So a CWA is actively governed and governed by a board and a project executive. So lots of governance, lots of reporting. Transparency, nothing's hidden. And I can remember at Spring Hill where we put each members of the supply chain's build up of their cost up on the wall for everybody to have a look at and make comment and critique. One of the things we suffer from as an industry in New Zealand is the ability to do first principle in estimating, man hours, materials, supervision, equipment. And again, to me, it's an art that's slowly being eroded, but it's a key ingredient in a CWA. And I think the last thing is quantifying risk. Now we all talk about that's a risk, this is a risk. And I know myself in a traditional environment, you know, risk, you slam some money against it without actually really quantifying what you may or may not need. And often as you workshop that risk, you discover you've got a management mechanism to deal with it, and it doesn't require any money at all. So one of the things about collaborative working is you strip all that monetary risk out and it's kept in another pot, so to speak.
Okay, thanks, Martin. That's great. So we'll turn to kind of the why CWA, and we'll hear from Rob Stephen, who's got experience in this sort of space. Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, morning, everybody. Yeah, just flicking in behind there, you'll see my first car, which is a 1969 Ford Cortina. I put that up because I was very proud of that. But I also used to maintain it myself. You know, there wasn't anything too complicated about cars back then. I think that particular one was assembled in New Zealand. Fairly simple vehicle, fairly simple to maintain. The car that's in there now is not my car, maybe the car I want, but there's no way I'm going to be getting in and maintaining that vehicle. It's just far too technically complex. It's controlled by computer systems, but every part of it is incredibly more sophisticated. And in many ways, for me, that's a bit like what's actually happened to the building industry. And in a way, perhaps we haven't seen it evolving at quite the speed we have in motor vehicles. We don't concentrate on this or notice it as much. But modern buildings are, are incredibly complex technical operating systems, really, compared to what they used to be. And that changes the game considerably. Not only does it change it in terms of complexity for delivery and build, but also of cost and investment, which is a big issue for the client now. So there is every building now that's looked at, an office buildings here in Wellington, I'm noticing they're all going into quite sophisticated base isolated buildings. None of those are simple buildings. There's no simple question of a simple base build and a simple fit out and a return after 20 years. That's long gone. And the other thing that's happening is that clients' business requirements are also something that is more complex, more changing than in the past, where it was a lot more stable as well. So actually delivering and working in a building with a big investment where business is changing is actually always a challenge. Probably though, for me, and more broadly in terms of collaboration, what's important about how to deliver that is the working with advisors, consultants and contractors together. That's really important. Otherwise, in all the work I do, I find that's critically important to actually join up and form a team from all the way from client all the way through to the delivery, or you don't get the outcome that you need and that you want to invest in. So, and in doing that, you need to build the right culture and build sort of an A team you're going to keep together throughout the project. So these projects have long lifetimes. Some of them are sort of 5-10 years in length, so it's a long time to hold a team together. Of course, there's that constant pressure, or the triangle as we know it, time, cost, quality, tension that always sits within every program. That hasn't changed in terms of what we're trying to do and we have to deal with in a project. And always the factor in there is how you manage risk and how that balance is struck and how you work through that. I don't think any one party is well placed to manage risk in modern projects, or even probably ever, but particularly in the modern construction and design and construction industry. So it needs to be done collaboratively. We need to work out who is best to hold the risk and to work together on that. And that's the best way to bring that triangle into some sort of balance. Mike,
Thanks, Rob. That's great. So what we'll do now is we'll hear from Martin on why a CWA from a contractor's perspective. Martin.
Thanks, Mike. Well, I think the current market issues are up there on the slide, pretty straightforward. COVID is obviously a bit of a game changer for us all for a whole host of reasons. But I think over the last wee while, I've seen all sorts of varying conditions of contract and how they deal with cost and time on a project. And, there's all the varying terminology that goes with that. Whether it's suspension, whether it's force majeure, whether it's a variation. And of course, contracts in the public sector have taken a more of a variation approach, where private sector clients have often used a different approach, and we're seeing constantly modified conditions of contract. I think one client said to me recently, well, I'm just as affected by COVID as you are. So, it creates for a very difficult situation. We're all seeing the impact of resources, and I'm talking really people, human resources, people resource there. And that's both needing more people and the skill set of those people. So that's a constant problem that we face. And I think one of the best things about why a CWA is that we basically select the best team for the project, irrespective of where they've come from or out of which organisation. So at the end of the day, the CWA is going to get the best resource. Again, material supply issues. Again, a lot of that can be negated within a CWA. And obviously the issue around cost escalation. So we're all seeing what's happening in that space now. Structural steel is a really good example, where a lot of specialist contractors are holding their price for a week or two currently, because there's so much volatility in that market. The ability in a CWA to go out and purchase all the steel in one go may help negate that, and that's why a CWA is useful. Obviously, in a traditional contract, fixed lump sum contract, all those items above are going to create issues where, you know, the current way of dealing with a fixed lump sum is there's no cost escalation, and really once it's signed up, the risk kind of all sits with one party. Certainty of delivery is obviously a key issue, and we know that CWAs will deliver on time, quality, cost, and the ever-present safety. And I think the benefits are leveraging out of an integrated project team. And a good example is in your design team, you put the window fabricator's designer, he sits in the design team and designs the windows once. Cost certainty is obviously another key issue, and the development of a TOC or target outturn cost that Michael talked to helps ensure that you've got cost certainty and best practice delivery. I think one of the great things about a CWA is that it kind of turns the triangle that we normally use, where the client's at the top and the guys out in the field are at the bottom of the triangle. A CWA actually turns that triangle upside down, and basically everybody's job is to ensure that those guys in the paddock who are delivering time, quality, cost and safety have all the tools and all the information to provide best practice. So there's no standing around waiting for an instruction or waiting for some part of a shop drawing to be approved. It's dealt with very quickly and succinctly, and it allows those people in the paddock to get on and do what they're good at doing, which is delivering projects.
Right.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. That was a great summary. So look, I'll turn now to sort of the process, and what I thought might be useful is to provide an introduction via some general principles. And so these can be collapsed into sort of three areas: behavioural, commercial and legal. So on behavioural, there's a need for strong ethical behaviours and actions. This requires trust and cooperation to be applied to all actions. This is fundamental. It needs to go deep into the supply chain. It's not just the senior manager's role only, but all of the governance group, the construction team managers and the workforce itself. The best for project approach, that's talked about a lot in the industry. However, it's imperative this is actioned every day in a CWA at all levels of the operation for the project. It gives one pause to think with the addition of at least equal to self-interest, and that should be the benchmark used in all CWA conversations. If we turn to the commercial principles, this is about open book and honest actions, and Martin's sort of mentioned that. The agreement is set in an open book environment, albeit with commercial framework and shared risk and targeting what's most efficient for delivery for the project. What this means in practice is the participants' scope boundaries can sometimes be blurred compared with a conventional contract methodology. Lastly, the no blame and no claim principles enshrined in the agreement. The typical agreement does include various definitions for structure, the management and delivery, but many of the principles are also described as specifically included in a CW agreement. For example, giving equal weight to project and self-interest. Single body retains the legal right to assess all commercial matters within the project, and costs are auditable. So these principles suggest it's not just a business as usual agreement, and it requires a great deal more than just cooperation and spirit. When fully exploited, the contractual boundaries can be eliminated in favour of a single risk-reward mechanism in which the client and the delivery team, delivery sort of project ecosystem can share the gains and hopefully minimise the pains. So I thought maybe it'd be useful to break the process down into 3 parts. As you'll appreciate, the portions of these parts will overlap, but generally they're seen as 3 parts. But before I do that, I thought it's probably worthwhile just reviewing some of the terms. So the principals group is the final arbiter and decision maker. It consists of reps from the client, the contractor, and the consultant, as Martin's mentioned. In the case of a client who may have 2 members in that group, they still only have 1 vote. Although I do note that somewhat of a moot point, given the CWAs that this group have been party to, all decisions were required to be unanimous anyway. The principals group provides the governance and charged with resolving any differences or issues, which is referred to it. It also is the party that makes the recommendations to the client for payments to the CWA members. Reports from all areas of the project are available to all, except commercially sensitive individual company information. For sensitive information, for example, the CWA facilitator is able to report that on behalf of an independent auditor. The day-to-day management is undertaken by the Project Executive Group, or PEG, which is made up of the CWA core members. Selected, and the individuals in that are selected on a best for project basis and approved by the principals group. In my experience, other non-core CWA members can be seconded into the PEG depending on the stage of the project. This is obviously done to add some expertise as it's needed through the course of the project. The CWA manager generally chairs the PEG meetings. The CWA manager is generally a person from the lead contractor, but it can be anybody. The duties of the CWA manager are akin to a project director. Now, the other area I thought would be useful just to touch on in the definitions is the total outturn cost. And this is developed within the course of the setup and the CWA formation stages. The timeframes may be several months for this to occur, and it will require reasonable effort from many. The formal negotiation framework agreement covers this work, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And the compensation is paid if the project is not progressed to a full subject CWA. The client costs are also included in the top, and these are the fully burdened costs. Various fees, compliance costs are included, and so too, for example, the project insurance costs. And I've some interesting experience in that when explaining insurance cover to sets of subcontractors, where the issues of stolen tools seem to be the issue du jour for those groups. But of course, the project insurance is a much wider area, and it's an issue all to itself. The profit is represented by a lump sum in the top build-up, and is the aggregate of the BAU profit margins from all the CWA members. The BAU profit is calculated as and paid as a percentage of actual costs. So, stage 1. Given the novelty, potentially, of a CWA arrangement, some educational components will be required. Initial education and awareness raising, workshops to introduce the principles of collaborative working, and also likely to require a deeper understanding of commercial issues and commercial openness. To some extent, the CWA participant selection process goes hand in hand with the education process. My experience is that the client and CWA facilitator will need to formulate some criteria for the selection. The selection may be a combination of objective and subjective criteria based those selections on. The client side and possibly their own organisation executive or board may also need understanding of the commitments that that party is making to a CWA. Once the core team is selected, it's traditional that team building occurs. It's well understood that in all forms of alliances and CWAs, the time spent in this area developing trusting and high performance teamwork pays dividends later on. The negotiation frame, which I mentioned before, the NFA, as I mentioned, is essentially an interim agreement. This framework allows potential non-core participants to be introduced and maybe even kind of tested by the core team. The use of the NFA is important as it facilitates the TOC and the final CWA agreement, which is negotiated on the way through. Before I move on, I'll just pause here and expand on the participant types. The CWA core members, typically main contractor, client, and lead consultant, which I've already touched on, are expected to be significant participants in the pain gain share. The CWA participants can and typically are parties who are likely to have significant influence on the efficiency and success of the project and are encouraged to be full pain gain participants. I note that participation doesn't need to be part of a pain gain arrangement, but they will still sign up to the agreement. The supply chain can be specialist contractors and subcontractors or consultants. And for example, it would be normal for those consultants to be managed by a core consultant. And of course, there's the material suppliers. And Martin's mentioned about the supply chain in respect to the main contractors. Getting the right balance of CWA participants, i.e. not too many, but targeting the parties who may have a strong influence and possibly influence success above their remunerated contribution to the project is really important to consider. So stage 2. This is where the real work begins. And there are two main areas that I'll concentrate on here. Is the cost, back of house management and risk assessment. And then secondly, delivery planning and programming. So the TOC is established at this stage. Due to the detail of the cost structure and the need for some participants to understand their own burden costs, their BAU profit as a percentage of the actual cost, some assistance might be needed in this area. Although I suspect that technology-assisted accounting has improved many small businesses' understanding of their own costs. So that should make that easier than it has been in the past. Part of the stage is also to determine who is the best CWA party to contract the supply chain, i.e. who can obtain the best pricing. These prices are the lowest cost to the collective CWA can obtain. There is no margin applied to these materials for CWA members, as the margins and the BAU profit are already accounted for in the makeup of the TOC. So for clarity, the BAU profit for any CWA member is remunerated as a percentage of their actual costs. The quantitative risk assessment, or the QRA, is progressed in parallel with the TOC. The QRA is a comprehensive risk cost schedule. The risk issues are all shared and cost estimates are debated with all key participants. And Martin, myself and Rob have talked about that ad nauseam. Those cost risks get debated hard and long. And the experience that we've all had is the list becomes very big, but over time it shrinks to a reasonably manageable area. Before the final TOC lockdown, the distribution of the risk is agreed within the CWA. For example, the client retain risk or the delivery group retain risk, which of course that gets included in the TOC. The issue of risk, in my opinion, is essentially a self-leveling one. And as an example, if a particular value is assigned to a risk is considered too high by the client can retain that risk cost. And in the discussions we've been having, there were a couple of really interesting examples that popped out, and I think it'd be worthwhile just articulating those in a little bit of detail. So Martin, could we start with your example?
Yeah, I think at Spring Hill, in the corrections facility at Spring Hill, we required millions of litres of diesel fuel to undertake the earthworks, and obviously to drive all the plant and equipment, utes, all that sort of equipment that was needed on the project. So one of the issues at the time was the volatility in the fuel market, mostly driven by the fact that the New Zealand dollar was all over the place. And I've argued for many years that no competent contractor is capable of managing the international foreign exchange market, but often that falls on deaf ears. But so what happened in the end, Downer were the civil component in the CWA. Their buying power for fuel was really quite significant. So basically the CWA took the risk on the quantity of fuel, and we agreed with the Crown basically a band. If the dollar went above that band or below that band, then the client took the risk or the upside, because if the dollar fell and then the dollar strengthened, there would be an upside to the client. Fortunately, we stayed within that band, and obviously the work done in estimating the volume of fuel needed was pretty good as well. The great thing was the Downer's buying power generated upside for all participants because of their ability to buy fuel in the marketplace.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Martin. And Rob, you've got an interesting story from a client side.
Yeah, probably. And this really did pay very big dividends. It's about, I guess, working together and trying to work out how to get through what is otherwise a difficult problem. It was the earthworks again. I think Martin mentioned fuel for trucks. The bigger problem with earthworks was there was a lot of quite a shortage of the appropriate equipment, particularly trucks, and the cost to hire the trucks and the running hours was really very high. So the CWA put their head together and said, well, what if we bought the trucks? Which probably sounded like a crazy idea at the time, but actually it was a really smart idea, and one that followed through. So the department actually of corrections bought the vehicles on advice with a buyback arrangement, and considerably saved on the operating cost. Not only did they make sure the trucks were there to serve them, but and get the job done, but also the cost was considerably lower than it would have been. And I heard figures bandied around about $10 million. I don't know whether those figures are true or not, but it certainly was a big saving, and that's something that the working together was a decision that would not only get over the problem of the amount of vehicles, but also the cost.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Yeah, look, that's a really interesting story, and I suspect that the person who was leading that component might well be online this morning, be able to reconfirm that. Okay, so thanks for those two stories. There are many stories that are similar to that, not necessarily in the scale, but certainly in the detail and the philosophy. So I'll carry on. So in terms of back of house, there are a number of back of house activities that need to occur in this second stage. Insurance, for example, may need to be suitably procured with an umbrella insurance policy with the provisions that support a no blame, no claim arrangement. The auditing, financial, accounting, and other examples of systems that are required from that back of house area. The delivery and program planning are areas that don't seem to get much attention, or as much attention as they should, in traditional construction projects. In CWA, there's a lot of emphasis placed on planning. This may be due to the wider participation of the client, the consultant, and other CWA members, all of whom are obviously very interested in helping with the planning. Maybe that's sort of trying to plan for success. And no doubt that the planning allows for a platform of seeking out productivity, performance improvements. So the issues of detailed planning, as I mentioned, they are extremely detailed, and a lot of that work happens at the same time as the development of the TOC and in the general understanding of the CWA arrangement. So stage three. Stage three is focused on implementing the plan and monitoring the outcomes. A key metric is monitoring man-hours expenditure. We're all aware of this, but I'm told by some in the construction side of the industry that this monitoring of man-hours isn't undertaken as much as it may well be. Some of the large projects I've personally been involved in, there is quite a lot of man-hours monitoring. But what the difference is in a CWA is the attention it receives from the general workforce, not just the managers. Productivity gains are a key to creating positive outcome and the possibility of gain share. This increase in productivity incentive manifests in the construction contributing culture and all contributing to positive outcomes. It's worth noting that an active client and consultant team have a multiplying effect on outcomes, contributing to solving issues before they become problems, for example. And also, in my experience and that of Rob and Martin, it's not uncommon for the consultants, the contractors, and the client to all operate in a shared space. The principals group, the project executive meet typically monthly, but maybe as required. In my experiences, there were more meetings than just monthly. Sometimes to deal with quite small matters, but sometimes to check up and help resolve challenges. The cost management, cash flow is monitored, and expenditure of the QRA reviewed and approved on a regular basis. Much to the client's satisfaction, planning for completion is undertaken early. This activity is also based on a collaborative process. For example, a client may bring in an operator or facilities team to learn about the operations of the project and how it's progressing, and may make some adjustments to the project as it progresses. I note that if there is a change, this may result in a cost or time change, and this may be some sort of variation. The TOC is amended to suit after review by the principals group. The financial status is reported regularly. Much of the status of the reports is available to all the CWA members. And I note that until the end of the DLP, defects liability period, the total cost can't be finalised. Thus, the TOC and the pain gain is not able to be calculated at this stage. So it's worthwhile now, this is my final slide, it's worthwhile just touching on the pain gain share because it does get a lot of airtime. So the pain gain share, as I mentioned before, is distributed at the expiry of the defects liability period, unless the principals group decides otherwise. And personally, I've been involved where that has occurred. I'll just make a few points on the pain gain share arrangements. Each participant within the CWA can determine their own level of financial risk in that pain gain share. The pain gain share is generally, the pain share is generally capped, or that's been the case for all the CWAs that I'm aware of and that this group have been involved with. The pain gain from all participants is symmetrical, exposure to the same level of pain and gain. Generally speaking, the individual companies will determine their risk as a proportion of their BAU, or business as usual, estimated profit. So by way of example, if a company calculate their profit at say 200,000, that they may decide to only put 100,000 at risk, and therefore that's their contribution to the pain gain share. The pain gain pool isn't huge, Now, I'm loath to suggest numbers, but I thought it'd be worthwhile just putting something out there. And that pain gain pool might only be in the order of 1 or 2, but not much more than that % of the value of the project. So my last point on this subject, the pain gain share is not the sole reason to be involved in a CWA, in my opinion. The primary motivators, in my opinion, include the ability to leverage others' knowledge and to improve your own business. You might be surprised at what your team learns. To become involved in a project with a downside risk capped, an area that a lot of businesses don't understand, but if you can cap your downside risk, generally speaking, your upside or your profit opportunities are taken care of, and reduce the stress on your whole team. You might find that people involved are hungry to work in a supportive and a collaborative environment. So now we're going to just wrap up in a few perspectives from each of the presenters. So I'll ask Rob, the client, to summarise his views. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Probably just very quickly, I think I covered it before, but the increasing complexity for me is one of the key things that drives collaboration. That innovation and problem solving is absolutely critical to getting through large projects. For us, obviously, the client at the centre of things is very important, and it's an eye not only on the success delivery of the project, but it's also ensuring that the operational costs, the performance, and the likely change with clients can go through over time is built and thought about through the design and delivered as part of it, so that when it's tested and commissioned, it doesn't stop there. It carries on throughout its lifetime. And to have confidence in the process, there really needs to be a transparent and fair process, one that you can really get under the hood with, that everybody is there together. You know, full disclosure is really important, no surprises, no blame's been talked about, but actually having that confidence really does require a level of digging into it and be able to see everything, so you can understand what those risks are and how they're shared and how you're going to work your way through the problem solving. That for me is key. And I'll just say that the big project that I was involved on the regional prisons development program, which was back in the early 2000s with 4 regional prisons, that would have been really difficult to deliver at that time to that program, and probably for that cost, without having run a process like the CWA.
Thanks, Rob. So from a consultant perspective, and this is just not my view, I've spoken to a lot of my colleagues in Becca and outside Becca, but it does give the consultants the opportunity to inject a lot more knowledge into the project because there are no contract barriers. The next area is I guess, a personal one for individuals. It increases their personal involvement. And it's fantastic to be involved where you're part of a holistic delivery team. And I guess lastly, I've been fortunate enough to be involved in large projects both in New Zealand and overseas. And I still have, where there's an opportunity to be much more collaborative, for example, Sky City, the original Sky City, I still have many friends in that arrangement, the collaborative arrangement, and they're friends for life. Martin.
Right, thanks. Obviously, this is not an arrangement where the contractor's the last one to speak, but it's just the way the slides panned out. But I think, to reiterate what Rob says, we know it works. And I think, I'd just like to take a second to recognise the late Stuart Ricks, who drove the regional prison projects. His CWA, or his view of the CWA, made that project a wonderful success, I think, when you consider the original starting point was a prison up north that was heading for litigation probably. And, you know, the CWA was brought to the table and it transformed the delivery of that prison project right throughout New Zealand. It cuts through all the contractual nonsense, and we've all been subjected to the vagaries of this, where, you know, and I like to use the example of shop drawings, where, you know, a shop drawing goes into some sort of approval process and rattles around sometimes for 3 or 4 weeks. Why perhaps design is finished, you know, things are changed, and the whole time basically, you know, slowing up the process. But that's the contractual mechanism that we use in our, you know, business as usual, and that's what we're left dealing with. I think lastly, it provides unprecedented efficiency and productivity because you measure it. It's, you know, and I know in the civil industry, measuring of efficiency is done pretty well, but in the vertical construction business that most of us are in, it's not done well, if it's done at all. So we've got poor productivity in the construction industry, the vertical construction industry in New Zealand, and this is a mechanism to improve that radically. Again, I'd just like to sort of quote the late Colin Smith, who was involved at Spring Hill. He used to ask people whether they were mooers or doers, and I think that's maybe his dairy farming background, but what he loved about collaborative working was he could get rid of all the mooers and it was only doers. So I think that kind of sums, this is about doing stuff, not talking about it.
Great. Well, thanks, Martin. So look, that summarises our presentation. I think Malcolm's going to manage some Q&A.
I will. Thank you very much for the 3 panelists. That was very good indeed. As I said, great alignment between collaborative working arrangements and the NZIOB's principles and what we're promoting as an approach to projects. Looking at the questions that came through, I've got a couple of mine as well, but just to look at the themes and lump some of these together. But starting off with a more holistic one, good question here is, how do we adequately assess the long-term value that a client will get from the asset? This needs to be a key part of determining the risk that they should carry, that's the client should carry.
Maybe I could touch on that, but just to give Rob some time to think. So in terms of the risk they carry in this collaborative working arrangement, the risks are all out on the table, be they cost risks or technical risks. And technical risk can be resolved by just pouring more money. And let's just take a simple example of piles, because they're relatively straightforward issues. Hopefully not too many geotech engineers here to throw rocks at me, but with the consultant, the contractor and the client all talking together, and the understanding of what those risks are, for example, technical risks, and the amount of money that is applied to them, that's a balanced view. You're not having a consultant try and create a gold-plated solution where the contract might say, well, my experience of this area is such and such. So it's not so much the long-term risks of the construction, but it's the risks associated with that balance of cost and risk, which the client becomes aware of. Rob.
Yeah, look, I think a couple of things. Is one, I think the basis of a CWA in terms of risk is that who's best placed to manage the risk. So it really doesn't matter whether it's client's going to benefit from the solution of that risk or not. It's actually about who's best placed. So you always need to be thinking about that. But having said that, certainly it's really important to focus on what is actually important and what is the value of the long-term building. And I'll give an example just to help. I'm in the middle of designing a new archive building, National Archive building, and it's a multi-rise building, which is very unusual, very difficult to manage the facade design. But amongst the design team, that is the number one most important aspect to get right. And we've had 4 goes at it and 5 different consulting teams and international advice to try and make sure we've got the right answer. So you just keep going. You need to just keep drilling and drilling into it to get the right answer. And you need a team that's going to be prepared to understand those risks.
Okay. Something that's a couple of questions on this, the difference between CWA and alliance contracting. 2 attendees have asked that question.
Do you want to have a crack at that, Martin? Or
Yeah, it sounds like a Martin response.
Yeah, it's not real. To be honest, it's not really my area of expertise. You know,
well,
I know with alliancing, there's a lot of commercial stuff put together as part of your submitting your alliance. So they're often done on a competitive basis, where a collaborative working arrangement is around putting the team together first and then getting into the commercial side of it.
Yeah, I guess an alliance depends on your definition, but an alliance is an umbrella philosophy of delivering construction projects. In New Zealand, we've used a couple of different forms of alliance, primarily in the horizontal infrastructure space. That's only one example. We've inherited some aspects of the Australian, and it's morphed over the last 20 years or so to sort of a 3-limb process. I guess my personal view, the biggest difference between how New Zealand sees an alliance and a collaborative working agreement is an alliance doesn't have that many participants. A horizontal, I'll be careful I say here, but generally speaking, the participants in a infrastructure project, which can be large, but the number of absolute participants is relatively small compared to a vertical construction project. It's well different. And the supply chain is much smaller in terms of capital value or cost, but a lot more participants. So the collaborative working agreement really recognises that, and as presented by our team, the need to bring in the participants who can influence the positive outcomes. It needs to go deeper than otherwise what an alliance might need to provide.
So in terms of the participants in the CWA, it's a couple of questions on this. It takes two parts. We talked about a core group, which was noted being client, consultant, contractor. So part of the question was how wide is that group? Is it wider than just the 3? In terms of consultants, obviously there's an architect, there's engineers and QS and so forth. And how are they selected? And then also the supply chain partners. When do they come on as part of the team? How deep does it go? And how are they selected through the same as with the core? What's the process for both?
I think I might start with that. One of the key things with selecting participants to be a full part of the CWA and sharing the pain share, gain share, is people that groups that can add value. And as Mike's alluded to, in a vertical construction, you've got all sorts of varying trades that add value. People often talk about the poor old painter, but in the prison project, the painter was part of the CWA and was able to add a lot of value and de-risk a lot of things because of the expertise they brought to the table. I don't think there's a template in the CWA that you can apply. Each one has to be looked at on its merits and the type of work being undertaken. And I think, one of the things we perhaps haven't mentioned is the CWA won't work in all situations. It's not something we're trying to flog to everybody. It's an alternative way of doing things, which I think allows you to do things very well, but it won't work in all instances. But you know, getting the right people on board, basically they have to be tested. When we were selected as the CWA, as the project executive team at Spring Hill, we were put through a day's testing as a team. One, to see, you know, there was leadership, but you know, it was a very hard day of being put through your paces by a group of external people.
Yeah, look, just to expand on that, there are different mechanisms that could be used for the selection of the core team, for example. The core team doesn't have to be just those 3 participating entities. If there's a particular area that a particular project needs to have a focus on, the only thing that springs to mind might be a data center, where it's not unusual for the lead consultant to actually be a building services engineer. In fact, it's the norm overseas, and it happens to be the situation on a project in New Zealand at the moment for a data center. So they would be a core member in a non-technical kind of building. They might not be a core member. But I do reference Watercare, and they are using what's called an agile process at the moment. And so that could be called upon, that kind of process, and it's not dissimilar to the situation that Martin mentioned about being grilled. So that could be a tool to be used in the selection of the core members, for example.
Yep. In terms of the supply chain, is that the main contractor who's tasked with engaging the supply chain, or is that more the core group?
It's a role of the whole team to decide where they want to go. And obviously some of that supply chain, you know, supply of concrete or supply of building materials, you know, that's often done on a competitive basis, or, you know, and again, I know at the Spring Hill facility, we use Carter's. Carter's actually set a branch up on the site. So basically all the material was bought in there in bulk and then basically went to the work face on a just-in-time basis, and it worked really, really well. And nobody was invoiced for that material until it went out of that yard on the site.
Yeah, that's right. That supply chain, it's a matter of collaborating. There's obviously the main contractor will have most experience, but there'll be other parts of the original core team that have got other experience they can add to it. So it's a collective decision process.
Right, we're in our final minute here. Here's a question here. What's the depth of knowledge and experience here amongst clients, consultants, contractors with CWA here in New Zealand?
Well, it's relatively limited because the market, even though the construction accord has been outlining the need for more collaboration in the industry, the decision making on the procurement has been a bit slow. I'm really pleased to see examples of collaborative processes progressing. Minister of Education, Stuart Ricks, and myself presented to the Minister of Education 2.5 years ago. And so they're using essentially a collaborative working arrangement for the Nelson Marlborough School, which is, you know, $150 to $200 million project. So there are areas that it's being developed. We've provided some background on a process that we've had experience with. It can be morphed. And in fact, the final agreement in a CWA is delivered or produced during that negotiation framework phase. So the experience we've had may be morphed a little bit to suit a particular project.
And I think just to add to that, there's got to be a willingness. One, you know, you've got to have a big cultural behavioural shift. And, you know, you've got to move away from a master-servant relationship, which sadly most vertical construction projects operate in that sort of sphere. And we've got to do something about our productivity. And we're suggesting this is a mechanism for, in the right sort of project with the right sort of client and the right willingness. This is the way to go. And there's people out there pushing it currently, but like I said, there's got to be a willingness, and people have got to understand that, you know, we've got this volume of work coming, and currently the vertical industry is not capable to deliver it unless we do something differently.
Very good. We better wrap up here. Rob, any last words from you as the client representative?
Yeah, look, I'd say that it has been difficult. I've been quite keen to look at different ways of delivering of projects, and it is difficult because the environment, like collaborative working, isn't standard within the way we deliver. So we're often constructing around. We're looking at the way we can collaborate and partner in using traditional formats. It's not highly successful, and I do think we suffer from you know, true collaboration, transparency, and certainly the efficiencies are not there that you would get from it. So I think it's a work in progress, and I think there's a call now for a lot more of this to be looked at and developed into more collaborative working arrangements. I think of this sort, exactly what that might be. I think we really need them. We need to really respond to that.
Yeah, and NZIOB is very, very pleased to be able to sort of start showcasing these alternative methods of delivering projects. So thank you very much to the panel of three, the contractor, the consultant, and the client. I trust it's been very informative for our attendees. We better close that off now. So thank you once again.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.